Andrew Morrison thought he was just stopping by one of his luxury hotels, until two little girls with familiar green eyes made him question everything he thought he left behind. Andrew Morrison's morning had started like any other, with precision, silence, and a mental checklist that left no space for error. The air was brisk as his driver pulled up to the front of one of his boutique hotels, a sleek, modern property with mirrored windows and granite columns that reflected his name, his power, and his expectations. He stepped out of the car, briefcase in one hand, already thinking about the first boardroom call he had scheduled in 42 minutes. He didn't see the girls right away. He only heard something that didn't belong in his world, soft crying, muffled but close, just around the corner of the entrance. He stopped mid-step. He hated interruptions. But something about the sound, fragile, frightened, made him turn. There, near the edge of the front window, sitting on the cold concrete beneath the towering glass facade, were two small girls. They were huddled close together, arms wrapped tightly around each other's shoulders, identical in every way. Their auburn hair curled in loose waves, cascading over pastel jackets stained with dirt. Their green eyes, wide and glistening with tears, met his for just a second before the younger one buried her face in her sister's shoulder. Andrew's first instinct was to call security, let them handle it, and move on with his day. But he didn't. Instead, he walked slowly toward them, crouching a few feet away, lowering himself so he wouldn't tower over them. He noticed their tiny shoes, untied and scuffed, and the way their small hands trembled as they held onto each other. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice softer than he was used to using, the words almost unfamiliar in his mouth. The older girl nodded. Her chin quivered, but she didn't look away. "We were with Mommy," she said quietly. "But then there were too many people. We couldn't find her anymore." Andrew blinked. She couldn't have been more than 5. Her sister may be by minutes younger, but just as small, just as vulnerable. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emmy," the girl replied. "And this is Lily." The second girl peeked out, eyes still red and fearful. Andrew looked around. No adult nearby. No frantic parent searching. He tapped his watch out of habit but didn't check the time. Something inside him had already shifted. He extended a hand and said, "Come inside with me. It's warm, and we'll find your mom." Emmy hesitated, then took his hand with a grip much stronger than he expected from someone her size. Lily followed closely, still clutching her sister's sleeve. As the doors of the hotel slid open and the warm air embraced them, Andrew realized something he wouldn't be able to explain later. The moment their tiny hands reached for his, everything else, his schedule, his image, his plans, blurred at the edges. He had no idea who these girls were or how they'd wandered into his world, but he knew, with startling clarity, that they were about to change it. Inside the lobby, the shift from cold pavement to warmth was immediate. The marble floor beneath their feet gleamed, the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood lingering in the air. Guests moved in and out, their footsteps quick, eyes focused elsewhere, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding near the entrance. Andrew guided the girls to one of the plush velvet armchairs near the fireplace, motioning for the concierge to bring water and something warm for them to eat. Without being told, the staff moved with silent efficiency, glancing at the children with concern but not questions. Andrew was known for his decisiveness, and no one dared interrupt his actions now. Emmy sat down first, carefully helping Lily up beside her. She didn't let go of her sister's hand. Their small legs barely dangled over the edge of the chair, shoes tapping against the frame as they shifted nervously. Andrew pulled over another chair and sat across from them, trying to soften his tone, which was naturally clipped and assertive. "Do you remember your mom's phone number?" he asked. Emmy shook her head. "She said we were going shopping. We went to a place with a lot of windows. Then she turned and we couldn't see her." Her lower lip trembled, but she didn't cry again. There was a kind of quiet strength in her voice that caught him off guard. Lily finally spoke, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "She said if we ever get lost, find a person who looks like they know where they're going. Her eyes rose to meet Andrew's, and he blinked, surprised. And you look like that, she added. He didn't know what to say. In his world, people rarely spoke to him like that, without calculation, without agenda. Children, he realized, didn't care about title or power. They responded to presence. And right now, he was the only one present for them. The concierge returned with hot cocoa, croissants, and a warm blanket. Emmy took the cup with both hands, whispering thank you. Lily followed her lead, still watching Andrew with curiosity. As they began to eat, their small hands steadying and their faces relaxing just slightly, he stood up and spoke quietly to the front desk manager. Call the local police. Let them know we found 2 lost children. And notify security to review all lobby and exterior footage. I want to find their mother. When he returned to his seat, Emmy looked at him and asked, Are you the boss here? Andrew gave a short nod. Something like that. She tilted her head. My mom said the man who owns this place has green eyes and a serious face. She said he's important but doesn't like people very much. Andrew blinked again, caught off guard. Did she say anything else? He asked slowly. Emmy thought for a second. Just that she used to know him. A long time ago. Something cold and sharp pricked beneath his ribs, though the room was warm. He hadn't heard those words, not like that, in years. He studied the girls again. Those green eyes, that shade of auburn. They weren't just familiar. They were unmistakable. But it couldn't be, he told himself. It wasn't possible. Still, his pulse shifted, his mind racing through names and faces from a lifetime ago. The moment he had heard their mother described, the way she had spoken of him, the way these girls looked, it all began to gather into something undeniable. He didn't yet know the full story, but something in his chest tightened with the certainty that this wasn't just a chance encounter. For the first time in years, Andrew Morrison felt the ground beneath him begin to move. And he didn't want to stop it. While the girls finished their cocoa, Andrew stood near the tall windows of the lobby, watching the sidewalk as if expecting someone to appear from the crowd with open arms and answers. He was trying to remain composed, but his thoughts spun faster than he could control. The pieces didn't just feel familiar, they fit too easily. He hadn't thought about Marina in years, at least not consciously. But now her name hovered in his mind, impossible to shake. He remembered her laughter, her fiery hair, the sharpness in her eyes when she was angry, the softness in her voice when she whispered things no one else ever heard. They had parted on tense terms, their final argument punctuated by his ambition and her silence. He had never imagined their paths crossing again. Behind him, the girls' soft voices broke through the tension. They were whispering to each other, huddled close like kittens in a storm. Emmy had taken off her jacket, draping it over Lily's shoulders. The gesture, simple and protective, twisted something deep in Andrew's chest. He couldn't shake the sense that he should have known them sooner, that he had already lost too much time. Security came by with footage from the entrance, pausing the video on the girls arriving alone from the street. No woman appeared behind them. Andrew scanned the screen twice, then ordered the team to expand the search radius. If their mother had been nearby, she was gone now. 10 minutes later, the front desk called out his name. A woman had arrived, out of breath and red-faced, asking about 2 little girls. Andrew turned toward the sound with a strange mix of dread and hope. He stepped into the hallway just as the woman walked in from the street. The moment he saw her, he froze. The red curls, slightly wind-blown and damp from cold air, the way she clutched her coat too tightly, and the unmistakable flash of those same green eyes, older now, more tired, but still hers. Marina. She saw him too. Her steps slowed, her breath caught, and her expression shifted from panic to disbelief. She didn't speak right away, and neither did he. It was as if the air between them had thickened, locking them both in a moment neither had prepared for. She looked past him and gasped when she saw the girls. They cried out together, "Mommy," and ran toward her. Marina dropped to her knees, pulling them into her arms, holding them with a desperation that said she'd been holding herself together just long enough to find them. Andrew stayed still, watching the scene, unsure if he belonged in it. But when Marina finally looked up at him, her eyes full of tears and 100 unspoken thoughts, something inside him gave way. "Marina," he said quietly. "It's you." She nodded, brushing hair from Emmy's forehead. "It's been a long time," she whispered. "I didn't expect this. Any of this." He wanted to ask 100 questions, but the girls were clinging to her, and the moment was fragile. Instead, he offered the one truth he could say out loud. "They look just like you. But their eyes, they're mine." Marina didn't answer right away. Then she gave the smallest nod. "Yes. They are." And just like that, the world shifted again, because everything that had felt like coincidence now made terrifying, beautiful sense. They sat together in a quiet corner of the hotel lounge, far from the bustle of check-ins and conference calls. The girls, now calm, nestled between Marina on the couch, their small bodies pressed against her sides as if trying to make sure she wouldn't disappear again. Andrew sat across from them, his posture rigid, his hands folded tightly in his lap, but his eyes couldn't stop moving, from Marina's face to the children, to the pendant around Emmy's neck, and back again. He didn't know what he expected to feel. Anger. Betrayal. Maybe even relief. But what settled into his chest was a slow, heavy ache for the time he hadn't even realized he'd lost. Marina looked different, and not just because years had passed. There was something in the way she held her daughters, something strong and exhausted at the same time. Her fire hadn't gone out, but it had learned to burn quietly. He could see it in the lines around her eyes, in the way her jaw tightened every time she looked at him and then looked away. She was the same woman he had once loved so fiercely, and the same woman he had walked away from without ever looking back. When the girls were distracted with a toy from the hotel gift shop, Andrew finally asked the question that had been clawing at him since he first saw their eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Marina exhaled, not with frustration, but with the fatigue of someone who had rehearsed this moment alone in her head for too many years. "I tried," she said. "Twice. I wrote you. The letters came back unopened. Then I thought about calling, but I'd seen the news articles, the interviews. You were everywhere, and still nowhere. I didn't want to be the person who dragged you back into something you'd clearly left behind." Andrew's throat tightened. He remembered how focused he'd been back then, how ruthlessly he'd cut out every distraction. Marina hadn't been a distraction, she'd been the center of his world, but he hadn't known how to keep her and keep his momentum. He had chosen ambition over connection, and now he was staring into the eyes of two little girls who had grown up without knowing his name. "You should have tried harder," he said softly, more to himself than to her. She didn't argue. Instead, she said, "Maybe. But I didn't want to beg. And I didn't want them to ever feel like they weren't wanted." The words hit him like a blow. He looked at the twins, now laughing quietly together, as if their world had just clicked back into place. "I would have wanted them," he said. "If I had known." Marina nodded. "And now you do." The silence stretched between them again, filled with years they couldn't get back. But then Emmy turned around and held out a drawing, a stick figure family with 3 people and a 4th just barely added, his suit drawn in with a green crayon. "That's you," she said. "You're new, but you can stay." Andrew took the paper with a trembling hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was an invitation. And he realized, for the first time in his life, he wanted nothing more than to accept. The next morning, everything felt different. The world outside was the same city, the same skyline, the same early buzz of traffic, but inside Andrew's suite, something had shifted in a way he couldn't ignore. He had offered to let Marina and the girls stay the night in one of the adjoining rooms, insisting it was safer and simpler while they figured out what came next. Surprisingly, Marina had agreed. Maybe because the girls refused to leave his side. Maybe because she hadn't had the strength to argue after the long and emotional day. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside, she wanted to see what it looked like when he stayed. Andrew barely slept. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, reliving every detail of the last 24 hours. The weight of it all didn't overwhelm him, it sobered him. For the first time, he had a reason to stop thinking about profit margins and quarterly forecasts. 2 reasons, really. And one he'd never truly let go of. When morning came, he found Marina already awake, seated near the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and her eyes were on the skyline, though he doubted she was really seeing it. He greeted her quietly, not wanting to startle her, and she turned slowly, offering him a faint but genuine smile. "They're still asleep," she said. "They kept waking up during the night, afraid I'd vanish again." Andrew nodded, understanding more than he expected to. "I didn't sleep much either." They didn't speak for a while after that. There was a tenderness in the silence, not awkward, but cautious, like both of them were learning how to be near each other again without unraveling. Eventually, he asked what had been sitting at the edge of his mind all morning. "What happens now?" Marina lowered her gaze. "That depends. I don't expect anything from you, Andrew. They don't even really know who you are yet. They know you helped. They feel safe with you. But I haven't told them the rest. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to." He stepped closer, folding his arms not out of defensiveness but as a way to steady himself. "I want to. I want them to know. And I want to be in their lives, if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face with the same instinct she used to have years ago. Then she asked softly, "Are you sure you're not just reacting? That this isn't guilt or obligation?" Her question was fair. He would have asked the same thing if their roles were reversed. But when he answered, there was no hesitation in his voice. "I've built everything around control and distance. I told myself that was strength. But yesterday, it wasn't guilt. It wasn't duty. It was clarity. I looked into their eyes and saw myself. Not just physically. I saw how much I've missed. I don't want to run anymore. I want to earn the chance to be their father, even if it takes time." Something in Marina's expression softened. She placed the coffee cup on the table and nodded slowly. "Then we take it one step at a time." That day, they told the girls the truth. Carefully. Gently. Marina explained first, starting with memories of a man she once loved, and how sometimes grown-ups make choices they later regret. Andrew sat beside her, silent until Emmy asked him directly, "So you're our dad?" He looked at both girls, his heart pounding, and said, "Yes. I didn't know before, but now I do. And if it's okay with you, I'd really like to be part of your life." Lily blinked, her green eyes wide. "Can we still live with Mommy?" He smiled, eyes damp. "Of course. Nothing has to change today. I just want to be around more. Help when I can. Learn who you are." There were no tears, no dramatic embrace. Just 2 little girls scooting closer and climbing into his lap as if they had done it 100 times. In that quiet, simple moment, Andrew felt something begin to mend inside him. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in years, real was enough. The weeks that followed moved more gently than Andrew expected. There were no sudden declarations or dramatic gestures, just a quiet rhythm forming day by day between him, Marina, and the girls. He had imagined this process might be more like a negotiation, filled with uncertainty and tension, but it unfolded instead like something fragile learning how to breathe. Andrew didn't try to rush his way into their lives. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he controlled. He showed up when he said he would, stayed when it mattered, and slowly, the girls began to trust that he wasn't going anywhere. Every Sunday afternoon became theirs. Emmy loved visiting the botanical gardens, especially the greenhouse with the butterflies that landed on her sleeves. Lily preferred the science museum, especially the earthquake simulator that she insisted on testing multiple times with a nervous but proud grin. Andrew drove them, carried their jackets, answered their questions, and found himself laughing more in a single day than he used to in a month. He bought them ice cream even when it was cold, took photos of them until his phone ran out of storage, and memorized the tiny differences in their voices when they told him stories. At night, he often replayed those moments in his mind, wondering how he'd ever been content without them. Work didn't disappear, but its place in his life changed. He started saying no to late dinners and red-eye flights. He moved meetings to early mornings so he could be free in the evenings. His assistant was baffled but respectful, and when asked why, Andrew simply replied, "I have more important meetings now." Marina watched it all with cautious optimism. She didn't fall back into old rhythms easily, she was still protective, still aware of how fast trust could be broken. But she also didn't pull away. When Andrew picked the girls up from school, she'd invite him in for coffee. When they had to coordinate schedules, she didn't speak through gritted teeth anymore. One evening, when Lily scraped her knee at the playground, it was Andrew who carried her home, and Marina didn't object. She just looked at him with a new softness that hadn't been there before. The turning point came on a quiet Wednesday evening. The girls had been drawing in the living room while Marina cooked dinner. Andrew had arrived early, and instead of heading straight into conversation, he sat on the floor beside them and asked what they were working on. Emmy handed him a picture, 4 figures standing in front of a tall building with a sun in the corner and a dog that didn't exist but apparently was now part of their family. Each person was labeled Mommy, Lily, Emmy. And under the tallest figure, in clumsy handwriting, it said Daddy. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, not knowing if he should say something. But before he could, Lily crawled into his lap and said, "That's you. Because you stay." He hadn't cried in years, not even during breakups or funerals. But in that moment, he felt the tears come without shame. Marina entered the room just then, towel in hand, and stopped when she saw the scene. She didn't speak, but their eyes met, and this time she didn't look away. Later that night, as they stood together by the door, she handed him a folded note. It wasn't dramatic, just a few sentences scribbled in her familiar handwriting. "I was scared to let you in again. But you've shown up in ways I never expected. I don't know what the future looks like, but I'm willing to find out. For them. For us." Andrew held on to that note for a long time after she closed the door. Not as a promise or a guarantee, but as a sign that maybe, just maybe, something broken had begun to heal. And he wasn't going to let it break again. As spring settled into the city, life with the girls became less of a new routine and more of a permanent rhythm. Andrew no longer questioned his role. He no longer second-guessed his decisions around them or worried whether he was doing too much or not enough. He had learned the difference between being present and just being around. The girls noticed it too. They didn't ask anymore if he was coming back the next day. They knew. When he said, "See you tomorrow," it meant something now. It meant they could count on it. It meant he wasn't just a name or a face from a picture they were never allowed to ask about. He was their father, and that truth had rooted itself into every quiet moment they shared. Marina had started to open up in ways Andrew hadn't expected. They still kept things slow, careful, but there was a trust between them now, one that didn't require endless discussions or defenses. She would call him sometimes just to share something funny the girls had said, or ask for help picking out new shoes for their growing feet, or invite him to stay for dinner after a long day. The barriers she'd built for protection had begun to shift. Not disappear completely, but bend in his direction. He never pushed. He knew what it had taken for her to raise them alone, to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. And now that he was part of that world, he respected every step that brought them here. One evening, while the girls were asleep upstairs, Marina and Andrew sat together on her small balcony overlooking the neighborhood. It wasn't the luxury he was used to, but it felt more like home than any of the penthouses he'd ever lived in. The air was crisp, and the scent of blooming trees carried between them in the silence. Marina handed him a cup of tea and leaned back in her chair. "You're different," she said, not looking at him. "Not just with them. With everything." He didn't answer right away, unsure how to put it into words. Finally, he said, "They changed the way I see everything. I thought I had to be someone cold to be strong. I thought being a provider was enough. But I was building a life that no one could belong to. Not even me." Marina smiled a little, still not meeting his gaze. "I used to wonder how someone could love so deeply and still walk away. But I don't wonder anymore. I see now that you didn't know how to stay. And now you do." He felt her words settle over him like a quiet forgiveness. He didn't ask for it, didn't expect it, but the weight it lifted surprised him. He looked at her, not as someone trying to reclaim the past, but as someone finally grounded in the present. They talked for another hour, not about heavy things, but about the girls, the chaos of birthday plans, the question of whether Lily would finally stop sleeping with a nightlight. They laughed more than they cried. And when he stood to leave, Marina walked him to the door. For a moment, they stood too close, saying nothing. Then she said, almost shyly, "They told me last night they want you to come to the school play next month. Emmy says you're the only one who can take videos without your hands shaking." Andrew smiled, trying not to show how deeply that meant to him. "I wouldn't miss it," he said. She nodded, and without another word, gently closed the door behind him. As he walked down the street, hands in his pockets and heart full in a way it hadn't been in years, Andrew realized something. He wasn't trying to fix the past anymore. He was simply living the present. And for the first time in his life, that was more than enough. The day of the school play arrived on an unusually warm Friday afternoon. The air buzzed with the kind of energy only a gymnasium full of children, parents, and undercaffeinated teachers could create. Andrew sat near the front, his tie slightly loosened and his camera resting on his knee, already recording although the performance hadn't started yet. Marina sat beside him, her hand resting quietly on the bench between them, close but not quite touching his. Around them, the hum of nervous parents and excited children filled the room, but Andrew barely noticed. His eyes were on the small curtain at the side of the makeshift stage, waiting for the moment when two identical red-haired girls would peek their heads out to scan the audience. He knew they would be looking for him. Sure enough, a small hand moved the curtain just enough for Emmy's eyes to appear. She saw him and grinned wide enough for the entire row to see. Then Lily's head popped up next to hers, and she waved so enthusiastically the curtain nearly fell down. Andrew waved back, heart full. It was a small thing, maybe, to the rest of the world. But to him, it felt like everything he'd worked toward had been leading to this moment. Not the boardrooms or hotel openings or awards, this. The lights dimmed, and the play began, a chaotic and charming retelling of a fairy tale that somehow included pirates, talking trees, and a time machine. Emmy delivered her lines with perfect clarity and an exaggerated bow that made half the room laugh. Lily played a forest guide and spent most of her scenes pointing in the wrong direction, then correcting herself with a giggle. Andrew recorded every second. Marina occasionally leaned toward him, whispering commentary, and he responded with quiet laughter, never taking his eyes off the girls. After the performance, parents flooded the hallway outside the auditorium, congratulating their children and snapping photos. Emmy and Lily ran straight into Andrew's arms, still in costume, breathless with pride. "Did you see?" Emmy asked, cheeks flushed. "We remembered every word." Lily tugged at his jacket and said, "And you didn't even miss it. You were really there." Andrew crouched to their level and hugged them tightly. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," he said. And he meant every word. Later that evening, Back at Marina's apartment, the girls had fallen asleep on the couch, still in their dresses, with cupcake frosting on their chins and stars painted on their cheeks. Andrew and Marina sat in the kitchen, the soft glow of a single lamp between them. She poured him a glass of wine without asking, and he accepted it with a quiet nod. There wasn't much to say. The night had already said it all. Still, after a while, she asked, "Do you think you're ready?" He looked at her, not sure if she meant for something specific or just in general. "Ready for what?" he asked gently. She shrugged, eyes warm but serious. "For being in this. For staying." He didn't answer right away. He stood, walked into the living room, and gently picked up the drawing Emmy had left on the table earlier. It was a new one, this time with all four of them holding hands beneath a crooked sun. At the top, in uneven letters, it read, "Our family." He turned back to Marina, holding the paper. "I don't think it's about being ready anymore," he said. "It's about wanting to be here. Choosing it. Every day." She studied him, then smiled, that soft, familiar curve of her lips that he'd once known better than his own reflection. She didn't need to say anything. The answer was already in her eyes. As the evening deepened and the apartment filled with the quiet sound of breathing children and cooling tea, Andrew felt the final piece of his life settle into place. This wasn't the future he'd imagined back when his goals were spreadsheets and skyscrapers. It was better. It was real. And it was his. The ending of this story feels like a quiet triumph, one that doesn't need fireworks to feel powerful. What resonates most is how healing unfolds not through dramatic declarations but through everyday moments, school plays, shared drawings, whispered bedtime promises. Andrew's transformation is sincere because it isn't sudden. It's earned. It's layered. And it's grounded in presence, which is so often more meaningful than words. What I love most is that the story doesn't pretend everything is perfect. It acknowledges the pain, the lost time, the mistakes. But it chooses hope anyway. The past isn't rewritten, it's reconnected to something better. The girls don't just gain a father. They gain a man who wants to learn how to love them in the way they deserve. And Marina, without losing her strength, finally lets herself trust again. It's not a fantasy. It's what happens when someone truly shows up, and stays. It happened on an ordinary flight, one that seemed no different from thousands of others. The plane had just taken off, and passengers were settling in when a young black boy named John, traveling alone, caught the attention of a flight attendant named Emma. She leaned over to him and uttered just one word. A single word that made everyone around freeze. Time seemed to stand still, and a tense silence filled the cabin. Friends, what do you think about situations like this? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know your name and where you're watching from. We'd love to get to know you better. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear the rest of the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There are more thought-provoking stories ahead. The morning was calm, the kind of day that flight attendant Emma expected to pass without incident. She had done this routine hundreds of times before. Her navy uniform was crisp, her blonde hair tied neatly into a bun. As passengers filed into the aircraft, Emma moved through the aisles with a practiced smile, offering directions and adjusting overhead luggage. Among the sea of faces, one caught her attention, a young boy, no older than 10, sitting alone by the window in row 14. He was black, with wide, curious eyes that darted around the cabin. His hands clutched a small, worn backpack, the fabric frayed at the edges, as if it had seen years of use. His demeanor was quiet, almost too quiet, which Emma found unsettling. Where are his parents, she thought, scanning the rows around him. There were no obvious signs of an accompanying adult. The boy's presence alone wasn't the issue. Emma had seen unaccompanied minors on flights before. It was something about him, his silence, his body language, the way he seemed to shrink into the seat as if trying to become invisible. Emma's smile faltered as she walked past him. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Emma couldn't shake the feeling. She leaned into the galley and whispered to her colleague, "Did you notice that boy in 14A? He's by himself." Her colleague, a cheerful woman named Sarah, nodded. "Yeah, he's an unaccompanied minor. His paperwork checked out at the gate." Emma frowned. "Still, doesn't it seem odd? He hasn't spoken to anyone, and I don't know, something feels off." Sarah shrugged, brushing off Emma's concern. "Kids get nervous flying alone. He's probably just shy." But Emma wasn't convinced. She watched as John stared out the window, his small hands gripping the armrest. "What's he so nervous about?" she muttered to herself, her mind racing. To Emma, the boy's silence wasn't innocence, it was suspicious. The thought began to gnaw at her. What if he wasn't supposed to be here? As the beverage cart made its way down the aisle, Emma lingered near John's row, observing him closely. When she offered him a drink, he shook his head, barely meeting her gaze. She couldn't explain it, but something about the interaction set her on edge. Emma's mind began to craft a narrative. What if he wasn't traveling legally? What if someone put him on this flight for reasons that weren't right? The more she thought, the more her suspicions grew. For the rest of the cabin, it was a typical flight, passengers reading books, scrolling on their phones, and chatting with seatmates. But for Emma, this was no ordinary journey. She felt a heavy responsibility to investigate further. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that her fixation on John would turn an otherwise unremarkable flight into a moment of chaos, judgment, and deep reflection. Emma's steps were deliberate as she made her way back down the aisle toward row 14. Her eyes darted briefly to other passengers, but her focus never strayed from John. The boy was still sitting quietly by the window, his small frame pressed against the seat as though he wished to blend into the wall of the aircraft. Her mind buzzed with questions, doubts, and assumptions, each one amplifying the other. Why wasn't he interacting with anyone? Why did he look so nervous? In Emma's mind, silence equaled secrecy, and secrecy meant trouble. As she stopped by his row, John glanced up at her, his wide brown eyes reflecting confusion and a hint of fear. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of Emma's scrutinizing gaze made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp. "Are you supposed to be here?" John blinked, unsure how to respond. He nodded slightly, his lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. Emma leaned in closer, her shadow falling over him. "Speak up," she demanded. "Where are your parents?" John hesitated, his voice barely audible. "I'm traveling alone." "Ma'am." Emma's eyes narrowed, and she straightened up. Her voice, now louder and firmer, cut through the low hum of conversation in the cabin. "Stand," she said. The word landed like a slap, loud and commanding. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Passengers in the surrounding rows glanced over, their curiosity quickly turning to concern. John froze, his small hands clutching the armrests. He didn't understand why she was asking him to stand, and the sternness in her tone only made him more nervous. "I said stand up," Emma repeated, her voice even sharper. A woman in the aisle across from them whispered, "What's going on?" Another passenger, a middle-aged man, leaned forward, frowning. "Is there a problem here?" John's cheeks flushed as he slowly rose to his feet, his knees trembling. He stood awkwardly in the narrow space between the seat and the window, his head barely reaching Emma's chest. Emma crossed her arms, her voice dripping with accusation. "Do you have your ticket? I need to see it." John fumbled with his backpack, pulling out a crumpled envelope handed to him at the gate. His fingers trembled as he passed it to Emma. She snatched it, unfolding the papers with exaggerated precision, her expression growing colder as she scanned them. Passengers nearby were now openly watching. A man in the row ahead turned and said, "Is this really necessary?" The kid's done nothing wrong. Emma shot him a glare. I'm just doing my job. Looks more like harassment, another voice muttered. Emma ignored them, her attention fixed on the boy. She handed the papers back, but her demeanor remained hostile. Sit down, she said curtly, and John obeyed, sinking back into his seat as if trying to disappear. For a moment, silence returned to the cabin, but it was tense and uneasy. Then, a voice broke through the stillness, a woman in the back row. Are you serious? This is unacceptable. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin, passengers shaking their heads and exchanging disbelieving looks. Emma stood frozen, her face flushed, unsure whether to defend herself or retreat. The judgment in the air was palpable, and for the first time, her authority was being openly questioned. But this was only the beginning. The cabin's uneasy silence would soon give way to outrage, and Emma's actions would be put under a spotlight she never expected. The tension lingered in the cabin long after Emma returned to the galley. Whispers drifted through the rows like the soft rustling of leaves, subtle but unignorable. Passengers exchanged glances, their confusion and discomfort growing. John sat stiffly in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look up. His heart pounded, the echo of Emma's harsh command, "Stand," still ringing in his ears. He didn't understand why she had singled him out. He had followed all the rules, hadn't he? Emma, meanwhile, couldn't let go of the lingering irritation she felt. To her, John's quiet demeanor wasn't innocent, it was defiant. She convinced herself that she was simply being vigilant, protecting the safety and order of the flight. But beneath that rationale lurked something darker, a bias she refused to acknowledge. As she made her way down the aisle again with the beverage cart, her gaze locked onto John. His small frame hunched further into his seat as she approached, trying to avoid eye contact. When she stopped by his row, Emma's voice was sharp and pointed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Are you going to sit there like that the entire flight?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. John's eyes widened. He looked up at her, unsure how to respond. Yes, ma'am," he stammered softly. Emma let out a small, mocking laugh. "Well, try not to make a mess. And don't touch the tray table unless you need to. We don't want any unnecessary cleaning, do we?" A passenger sitting across the aisle turned toward them, his brow furrowed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked quietly, but Emma ignored him. As she moved on, John felt his cheeks burn with shame. He shifted in his seat, trying to make himself as small as possible. The humiliation wasn't over, though. When the food service began, Emma returned with the cart. As she served the passengers around him, she pointedly skipped over John, moving on as though he didn't exist. "Excuse me," John said timidly, raising his hand. "Can I have?" Emma cut him off, her voice sharp. "You'll wait until I'm finished with everyone else." John's hand dropped instantly, and he nodded, his eyes cast downward. Nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances. "Is she serious?" one woman whispered to her husband. When Emma finally circled back to him, her tone was clipped and dismissive. "What do you want?" "Just water, please," John said softly. Emma set the plastic cup down with a hard thud, the water sloshing over the edge onto the tray table. "There," she said curtly before moving on. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A woman 2 rows back leaned toward her seatmate and whispered, "She's treating that boy like he's done something terrible. What's her problem?" John tried to ignore the stares and whispers around him. He kept his eyes on the small window, focusing on the clouds outside. But no matter how hard he tried to disappear, he could still feel Emma's gaze on him, heavy and judgmental. The first cracks in the passengers' patience were beginning to show. More than a few of them were watching closely now, their expressions shifting from confusion to quiet outrage. For John, the flight that was supposed to be a simple journey was turning into an unbearable ordeal. For Emma, however, this was only the start of her unraveling. The passengers weren't going to remain silent for long. The soft clinking of meal trays and the hum of the beverage cart filled the cabin as the flight attendants began distributing food and drinks. The passengers, eager to settle into the comfort of their meals, leaned into their trays, unwrapping sandwiches and sipping sodas. But for John, the ordeal of the flight continued to worsen. Emma, pushing the cart down the aisle, had a practiced rhythm. With a polite smile that barely touched her eyes, she handed out meals to each passenger, ticking off their requests with robotic precision. But when she reached row 14, her demeanor shifted. John sat still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was hungry, his stomach had been grumbling for the past hour, but he waited patiently, just as he'd been taught. When the cart stopped by his row, John looked up expectantly. Emma, however, didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she served the passengers on either side of him, bypassing him entirely. "Excuse me," John said softly, his voice hesitant. "Can I have?" Emma didn't let him finish. Without even looking at him, she muttered, "I'll come back later," and moved on to the next row. John blinked, confused. He glanced at the trays of food in the cart, his mouth dry and stomach aching. Passengers nearby noticed the interaction, or lack thereof, and began exchanging uneasy glances. "Did she just skip him?" whispered a woman across the aisle. "She said she'd come back," murmured her seatmate. But that seemed odd. Minutes passed, and Emma didn't return. John sat silently, his hunger growing. He didn't dare call out again, fearing her sharp tone. Around him, passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their murmurs growing louder. "Excuse me," said an older man in the row behind John, leaning toward Emma as she passed by with the cart. "I think you forgot the boy in 14A. Emma's smile tightened. "I'll get to him when I have a moment," she said curtly, her tone dismissive. The man frowned but said nothing further. Emma continued her rounds, serving the rest of the cabin while deliberately ignoring John. Finally, the cart came back around, this time offering drinks. John raised his hand cautiously. "Can I have some water, please?" Emma didn't even pause. "We're running low," she said over her shoulder, not bothering to stop. Passengers nearby gasped softly, their shock evident. A young woman in the row ahead turned to her seatmate. "That's not right. She can't just deny him water." The murmurs were no longer subtle. A man across the aisle leaned over and called out, "Excuse me, miss. The boy asked for water. Are you really not going to give him any?" Emma stopped abruptly, her posture stiffening. She turned, her expression cold. "Sir, I'll handle this as I see fit," she said sharply. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Emma turned back toward the galley, the cart rattling loudly as she pushed it away. By now, the cabin was abuzz with whispered conversations. "She's singling him out," someone said. "It's obvious. Why isn't anyone doing anything? I think someone should call the pilot." John sat frozen in his seat, his face flushed with humiliation. He could feel the stares of other passengers, though he knew they weren't directed at him out of malice. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or more embarrassed. Emma, on the other hand, marched into the galley, her frustration mounting. In her mind, she was maintaining order, but to everyone else, her actions were nothing short of targeted cruelty. The cracks in her authority were becoming evident. Passengers were no longer willing to stay silent, and their quiet outrage was building into something much larger, something Emma wouldn't be able to control for long. The faint hum of the engine seemed louder now, filling the uneasy silence in the cabin. John sat rigid in his new seat by the window, trying to remain as invisible as possible. He hoped that the worst was over, but Emma had other plans. Her frustration simmered just below the surface, bubbling into a cruel determination to assert her authority. Emma stopped by his row again, her polished shoes clicking against the floor as she loomed over him. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, their unease palpable. She crossed her arms, her expression cold and calculating. "John," she said loudly, deliberately using his name so everyone around could hear. Her tone was laced with irritation, as if addressing a troublesome child. John looked up at her timidly. "Yes, ma'am." Emma narrowed her eyes. "I've noticed you've been fidgeting and shifting in your seat. That's disruptive to the passengers around you." John blinked, confused. I wasn't trying to." She cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "It's not about what you were trying to do. It's about the effect you're having on others." Passengers nearby started murmuring, their whispers growing louder. "What is she talking about?" a woman across the aisle whispered. "She's making things up," replied the man beside her, his frown deepening. Emma ignored them, her focus solely on John. "I think it would be best if you moved to another seat," she continued, her voice loud enough to carry through several rows. "Somewhere where you won't disturb anyone." John's face turned red, his small hands gripping the armrests. "But, this is my seat," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's expression hardened, her tone becoming more commanding. "That's not up for debate. I'm instructing you to move for the comfort of the other passengers." The boy hesitated, glancing around for help, but no one immediately spoke up. He looked at the empty middle seat a few rows back, wedged between two strangers. It was smaller, less comfortable, and far from the window he had been quietly enjoying. "Now, please," Emma pressed, her voice sharp. John reluctantly unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling as he grabbed his worn backpack. As he stood, his head hung low, the tension in the cabin became unbearable. "That's enough," a voice called out, breaking the silence. It came from an older man sitting across the aisle. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed in anger. "Why are you making him move? The boy hasn't done anything wrong." Emma turned to him, her lips pursed tightly. "Sir, this is a matter of ensuring everyone's comfort. I would appreciate it if you let me handle the situation." "You're not handling it," the man shot back. "You're bullying a child." Several passengers nodded in agreement, their voices joining in. "She's targeting him. This isn't right. What's her problem?" Emma's cheeks flushed, but she maintained her icy demeanor. "I am acting in the best interest of all passengers on this flight. If you have concerns, you can address them after we land." John shuffled down the aisle, clutching his backpack tightly to his chest. The whispers and murmurs followed him like a shadow, and the disapproving stares directed at Emma grew sharper with every step. As he settled into the cramped middle seat, the passengers around him shifted awkwardly, trying to make room but offering little comfort. John kept his head down, his face burning with shame. Back at the galley, Emma adjusted her uniform and avoided eye contact with the passengers glaring at her. She convinced herself that she had acted professionally, but the growing wave of discontent in the cabin was undeniable. The tide was beginning to turn against her, and the silence she had relied on was cracking. Emma had underestimated the power of those watching, and soon, their voices would rise louder than her authority. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. The once muted whispers had grown into an audible murmur that rippled through the rows, like a storm building on the horizon. Emma, oblivious to the growing unrest, carried on with her duties, her posture rigid and her face a mask of forced composure. But the passengers weren't buying it. It began with a single voice, a woman sitting a few rows behind John. She leaned toward her seatmate, her voice loud enough to carry. "Why is she targeting that boy? He hasn't done a thing wrong." Her words acted like a spark to dry tinder. "She made him move for no reason," added a man across the aisle, shaking his head. "And did you see how she spoke to him? Completely out of line. She didn't even serve him food or water earlier," another passenger chimed in. "What kind of service is this?" Emma, hearing the rising murmur, paused in the aisle, her jaw tightening. She turned toward the source of the voices, her eyes narrowing. "If there's an issue," she began, her voice strained but still trying to sound authoritative, "I'd appreciate it if you addressed it respectfully." Respect, however, was the last thing the passengers were willing to offer her. "Respectfully," the older man who had spoken earlier said, his voice rising. "You've been nothing but disrespectful to that child since this flight started. What's your problem with him?" Emma stiffened, her gaze flickering toward John, who sat hunched in the cramped middle seat, his head down and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She felt the weight of the cabin's attention pressing down on her like a spotlight. "I don't have a problem with anyone," she said, her voice clipped. "I'm simply maintaining order." "Order?" a woman from the back row scoffed. "You call humiliating a child maintaining order? You're just being a bully." By now, more passengers were joining in, their voices growing louder and bolder. "Why did you make him move? Why didn't you serve him earlier? Do you treat all kids like this, or just the ones who look like him?" The last question hung in the air like a grenade. Emma's face flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a phone screen lit up in the aisle. A young man in his 20s had begun recording the scene, his camera pointed directly at Emma. "Let's see how orderly you look when this hits the internet," he said, his tone laced with contempt. "Put that phone away," Emma snapped, her voice cracking slightly. "Why?" the man shot back. "You're not ashamed of your behavior, are you?" "Because you should be." The cabin buzzed with agreement, passengers nodding and murmuring their approval. Others began pulling out their own phones, some recording, others typing furiously, likely recounting the scene on social media. Emma's veneer of control was crumbling. She turned toward the galley, her steps hurried, as if retreating would somehow restore her authority. But the voices followed her, their frustration growing louder. "This is outrageous. She's not fit to work with people. Someone needs to report her." Meanwhile, John sat frozen in his seat, overwhelmed by the chaos unfolding around him. He didn't know whether to feel relieved that people were standing up for him or terrified by all the attention. His small fingers gripped his backpack tighter, his knuckles white. One passenger, a woman with kind eyes, leaned across the aisle toward him. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. John nodded hesitantly, his voice barely audible. "I'm fine." But the passengers weren't fine. The cabin was now a wave of collective indignation, and Emma's retreat only fueled their anger. In the galley, Emma leaned against the counter, her hands shaking. She had started this flight in control, but now the very passengers she was supposed to serve had turned against her. What she didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. The fallout from her actions was about to grow far beyond the confines of the plane. The announcement came over the intercom, cold and calculated, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated and ensure all belongings are stowed. Upon arrival, please follow crew instructions carefully." Emma's voice, sharp and detached, echoed through the cabin. For most passengers, it was a standard message, but for John, it felt like a warning. As the plane began its descent, Emma's rigid posture and clipped movements betrayed her brewing determination. She had called ahead to request security at the gate, spinning a narrative that painted John as a disruptive passenger. In her mind, this was the only way to justify her actions, to reassert her authority after the passengers had begun to turn against her. John sat quietly in his cramped middle seat, clutching his worn backpack like a lifeline. He didn't understand why Emma had targeted him, why her sharp words and unkind glares were aimed only at him. His young mind searched for an explanation but found none. The cabin's murmurs grew louder as passengers exchanged incredulous looks. Many of them had witnessed every interaction between Emma and John, and none could fathom how the boy, silent, obedient, and visibly scared, could be accused of causing a disturbance. Emma returned to John's row just as the plane's wheels touched down. The jolt of the landing did nothing to soften her expression as she leaned over him. "Stay seated," she commanded, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. John looked up at her with tear-filled eyes. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Enough," Emma snapped, cutting him off. "I've had enough of your behavior. Security will handle this when we land." The boy's lip quivered, and the tears he had been holding back began to fall. Quiet sobs shook his small shoulders as he hugged his backpack tightly to his chest. Passengers began speaking out, their voices rising in collective outrage. "This is too much," a woman exclaimed. "He's just a child." "What behavior?" a man across the aisle demanded. "All he's done is sit there." Emma's face flushed, but she turned to face the passengers with a forced calmness. "I'm ensuring the safety and comfort of everyone on board," she said, her voice laced with feigned authority. "Comfort?" another passenger shot back. "You've been bullying him the whole flight." By now, several passengers had their phones out, recording the escalating confrontation. One of them leaned into the aisle, capturing John's tear-streaked face and Emma's stern demeanor. "Look at him," the passenger said, her voice trembling with anger. "He's crying, and you're still yelling at him. Shame on you." John's quiet sobs grew louder as he buried his face in his backpack. The noise seemed to fuel Emma's irritation. "This is exactly the kind of behavior I've been talking about," she declared, gesturing toward him. "Crying because he's scared," someone shouted. "You're out of control." The plane slowed as it approached the gate, but the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. Emma, now visibly flustered, tried to maintain her composure as she ignored the growing chorus of voices calling for accountability. When the plane finally came to a stop, the seatbelt signs turned off with a familiar chime. Emma moved swiftly toward the front of the cabin, ignoring the glares and whispered insults from passengers. John sat frozen in his seat, his sobs reduced to quiet sniffles. The woman next to him placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, her voice kind and reassuring. But for John, the sight of two uniformed security officers waiting just outside the gate as the plane's doors opened felt anything but okay. His tears returned, and as Emma gestured toward him, the officers stepped inside. The passengers erupted in protest. "You're not taking him," one man shouted. "This is ridiculous," yelled another. Emma's actions had lit a fire she couldn't extinguish, and the injustice of her behavior was now impossible to ignore. The passengers, united in their outrage, were ready to fight for John. But for the boy, the humiliation and fear were already seared into his memory, a cruel reminder of how the world had failed him in that moment. As the security officers stepped onto the plane, the tension in the cabin became unbearable. Passengers craned their necks, their phones poised to record every moment. Some whispered indignantly, while others sat silently, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. In the center of it all, John sat trembling in his seat, his tear-streaked face buried in his backpack. Emma, standing by the front row, gestured sharply toward John. Her tone was clipped and impatient. "That's the one," she said to the officers, her voice carrying through the cabin. "He's been disruptive and causing a disturbance for the entire flight." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. "Disruptive?" a woman near the middle of the plane exclaimed. "He hasn't done a single thing wrong." Emma's gaze snapped toward the woman, her expression tightening. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're not aware of the full situation. This boy has been uncooperative and," she hesitated, her lips curling into a faint sneer. "Frankly, it's not surprising." The murmur of voices instantly grew louder. "Not surprising," a man across the aisle said, his voice rising. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Emma's composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, doubling down. "Well, some people just don't understand how to behave in public spaces," she said, her tone icy. The passengers fell silent, stunned by her words. The implication was clear, and the weight of it hung heavy in the air. "That's racist," someone said loudly, breaking the silence. "Excuse me?" Emma shot back, her cheeks flushing. "You heard me," the man said, standing halfway out of his seat. "You're targeting him because he's black. That's the only thing he's done to disturb you." The cabin erupted into chaos. "She's been picking on him all flight. She's out of control. This is disgusting." Emma raised her voice, trying to regain control. "Everyone, please remain calm. I am responsible for maintaining order on this flight, and I will not tolerate accusations like that." "But you'll tolerate harassing a child," a woman retorted. "You've humiliated him, denied him food and water, made him cry, and now you're calling security on him for what?" "Sitting quietly." Emma's mask of professionalism cracked further. "I don't have to explain myself to any of you," she snapped. "This isn't about race, it's about respect. And some people need to learn it." The cabin went silent again, her words cutting through the noise like a knife. Emma's statement was more than just a defense, it was an admission. "Did you hear that?" someone said incredulously. She just said it outright. Phones were raised higher, cameras catching every word, every nuance of Emma's expression. One of the security officers, sensing the growing outrage, hesitated. He leaned toward Emma and spoke in a low voice. "Ma'am, are you certain this is necessary? It doesn't look like the boy has done anything wrong." Emma's response was sharp and dismissive. "He's been defiant and disruptive. Are you questioning my judgment?" The officer stepped back, clearly uncomfortable, but the passengers weren't backing down. "This is racism, plain and simple. We're not letting this slide. Someone call the airline right now." John, still seated, looked up at the chaos around him, his face streaked with tears. He seemed even smaller now, his shoulders hunched and his hands gripping his backpack as though it could shield him from the hateful words. A woman next to him leaned over, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, you've done nothing wrong," she said. Then, turning to Emma, she added loudly, "And we're not going to let you do this to him." Emma's face hardened, but the passengers' collective outrage was now unstoppable. The breaking point had come, and it was clear to everyone on that plane, this was no longer just about one boy. It was about standing up to the ugliness of prejudice, about refusing to let Emma's actions go unanswered. As the cabin erupted into shouts of protest and demands for justice, Emma began to retreat, her authority and composure unraveling completely. The passengers weren't just witnesses now, they were allies, ready to fight back against the injustice they had seen with their own eyes. The cabin was no longer a quiet space filled with the hum of engines and soft conversations. It was now a battlefield of voices, each one more indignant than the last. Passengers who had been strangers only hours ago found themselves united by a shared outrage, their collective anger directed squarely at Emma. "She needs to be fired," one man shouted, standing up from his seat. "This is unacceptable behavior for someone in her position." "You're not going to get away with this," a woman added, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've traumatized a child for no reason, and we all saw it." Emma stood near the front of the cabin, her back straight, her face pale but defiant. She glanced nervously at the growing number of passengers who were now on their feet, pointing fingers, recording videos, and calling out her name. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a brittle veneer of professionalism that was cracking under the weight of the outrage. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I understand there has been a situation on board, and I assure you it will be addressed appropriately once we land. In the meantime, I ask that everyone remain seated and allow the crew to do their jobs." The announcement did little to quell the passengers. "Captain, you need to deal with this now," a woman near the front called out. "Your crew member has been abusing her authority all flight, and we're not going to let her sweep this under the rug." "That's right," another man chimed in. We're not sitting down until she's held accountable. Emma's composure faltered further. She turned toward the galley, hoping to find refuge, but a passenger stood in her path, blocking her escape. You don't get to hide, he said firmly, his phone raised to capture her reaction. Explain yourself. Why did you treat that boy like that? Emma's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support, but none came. Even her fellow flight attendants looked uneasy, standing back as the passengers' outrage mounted. Everyone, please return to your seats, Emma said, her voice shaking but still trying to sound authoritative. This disruption is putting the safety of the flight at risk. A middle-aged woman near the center of the plane scoffed loudly. The only one disrupting this flight is you. You've been harassing that child since we took off, and now you want to blame us for standing up to you? More voices joined in, their anger growing louder and more unified. Call the airline. She needs to be removed from her position. This is going viral the second we land. The pilot, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, left the cockpit and stepped into the aisle. He raised his hands, signaling for quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your cooperation, he said, his voice firm but calm. Please allow me to speak with the crew and address your concerns appropriately. I assure you, this will not be ignored. The passengers hesitated, their voices lowering but their frustration still evident. The pilot turned to Emma, his expression unreadable. Emma, I need to speak with you in the galley. Now. Emma nodded stiffly and followed him, her movements robotic. As she disappeared into the galley, the murmurs in the cabin resumed. Passengers began sharing their recordings, showing clips of Emma's harsh words and John's tear-streaked face. She's done for, one man muttered, scrolling through his phone. I hope so, replied the woman next to him. But it won't undo what she did to that poor boy. John, still sitting quietly in his seat, watched the scene unfold with wide, frightened eyes. A kind woman beside him leaned over and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's going to be okay, she said softly. You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Despite her words, the boy's face remained etched with fear and uncertainty. For him, the ordeal wasn't over. But for the passengers, the fight for justice had only just begun. As the plane prepared to dock at the gate, the passengers exchanged determined glances. They weren't just witnesses to Emma's actions, they were now active participants in ensuring she faced the consequences. The plane taxied to the gate, but the atmosphere inside the cabin remained electrified. Passengers, many still standing, refused to let the situation fade. Phones were buzzing with activity, texts, videos, and social media posts were being shared in real time, documenting every moment of the incident. John sat quietly in his middle seat, his eyes red and puffy, clutching his worn backpack like a shield. The kind woman next to him stayed by his side, speaking softly to reassure him. Around them, the murmurs of outrage grew louder as the plane came to a halt. When the doors opened, security personnel stepped inside, their faces set with professionalism but laced with hesitation. They were immediately met with a wave of passenger resistance. You're not taking him, a man in the front row said firmly, stepping into the aisle to block their path. That boy hasn't done a thing wrong, added another passenger, holding up her phone. And we have the proof. The security officers glanced at each other, clearly unprepared for the wall of defiance they faced. One of them approached the captain, who had emerged from the galley with a tight-lipped Emma in tow. We need to de-escalate this, one officer murmured to the captain. The captain nodded, then addressed the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our destination. I ask for your cooperation as we ensure everyone's safe departure. Rest assured, the situation involving our crew will be fully investigated. This wasn't enough for the passengers. Investigated, someone scoffed. She humiliated that boy for hours. She doesn't need an investigation, she needs to be fired. The cabin erupted in agreement. Emma, now visibly pale, shrank under the collective weight of the passengers' anger. She avoided eye contact, her earlier bravado entirely gone. As John was escorted off the plane, not by security, but by a sympathetic flight attendant and several supportive passengers, the crowd erupted in applause. Many of them stayed behind, determined to share their videos and first-hand accounts with airport officials. By the time John and his escort reached the terminal, the first clips of the incident had already gone viral. Hashtags like #JusticeForJohn and #AirlineRacism were trending within hours. The internet, quick to amplify injustice, seized on the story with ferocity. Back at her hotel that evening, Emma sat alone in her room, scrolling through the flood of notifications on her phone. Every platform was filled with calls for her termination. Clips of her stern commands and cold demeanor were shared alongside captions condemning her behavior. Disgusting abuse of power. She shouldn't be allowed near passengers again. Fire Emma now. Her email inbox was flooded with messages from strangers, many of them vicious and personal. She felt the walls closing in, her decades-long career unraveling in real time. The airline, under immense public pressure, issued a statement the next morning. "We are deeply concerned about the incident that occurred on Flight 243. We have launched a thorough investigation and placed the crew member in question on administrative leave. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind." Emma's name trended for days as more details surfaced. Former colleagues began sharing stories of her previous behavior, painting a picture of someone whose biases had long gone unchecked. Her life had become unrecognizable. Strangers showed up outside her home, reporters hounded her for comments, and her social media accounts were inundated with threats. For Emma, the consequences were swift and merciless. Meanwhile, John's story inspired an outpouring of support from around the world. A photo of him holding his battered backpack, his face streaked with tears, became a symbol of resilience against prejudice. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people rallied behind him. Donations poured into a GoFundMe set up by a passenger to support his education and emotional recovery. Messages of encouragement flooded in from across the globe. "You're so brave, John. Don't let anyone dim your light. We stand with you." The airline arranged a formal apology and covered all his travel expenses. They also offered him free flights for life, though his family declined. "We just want him to feel safe when he travels," his mother told reporters. John's community rallied around him, too. His school hosted a special assembly in his honor, and local leaders invited him to speak at events about his experience. Though he was hesitant at first, he found strength in the support of those who believed in him. The incident sparked a national conversation about racism in customer service and the power dynamics within the airline industry. Advocacy groups used John's story to push for stricter accountability and anti-discrimination training for airline staff. For John, the ordeal was a painful lesson about the realities of prejudice, but it also showed him the strength of solidarity. For Emma, it was a reckoning, one that forced her to confront the biases she had long refused to see. And for everyone who witnessed it, both on the plane and online, it was a stark reminder that standing up against injustice, even in the most unexpected places, can change the world. Friends, what do you think about this story? It really makes you reflect on the injustices some people face in everyday life. Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share stories that touch hearts, inspire, and spark important conversations. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us for more.